The salt spray stung Han Suk-woo's face as he hauled the fishing net, his thin arms straining with the meager catch. The Jukbayan fishing village, nestled on the rugged coast of Joseon, offered little beyond backbreaking labor and the constant threat of starvation. Suk-woo, barely 16, was all too familiar with both. His body, though wiry, was perpetually weakened by malnutrition, a stark contrast to the plump sons of the local landlords who routinely mocked and bullied him. He gritted his teeth, the familiar sting of injustice burning in his chest. It wasn't just the lack of food, or the relentless toil, it was the constant humiliation. The casual cruelty of those born into privilege. He dreamed of a life beyond the fishing nets, a life where he could stand tall and command respect. But such dreams were as ephemeral as the sea foam that crashed against the rocks. Today, the bullying had been particularly vicious. Jo Pildu's lackeys, emboldened by their master's rising power as the Dagunsa, military commissioner, had cornered Suk-woo, accusing him of stealing fish, a blatant lie. The beating that followed was brutal, leaving him bruised and bleeding, his meager catch scattered on the sand. The final indignity, the one that truly broke him, was the false accusation they planted, implicating his family in a crime they didn't commit. He fled, knowing that his family would face ruin, or worse, at the hands of the corrupt officials. He ran, not knowing where he was going, driven only by blind panic and despair. He scrambled up the steep, rocky path that led towards the Taebaek Mountains, a place whispered to be haunted by spirits and wild beasts. The thought of facing such dangers was less terrifying than the certain fate that awaited him in the village. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry red, Suk-woo collapsed, exhausted and defeated. He lay there, staring up at the darkening sky, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his face. He wished, with all his heart, that he could just disappear. That the pain and injustice would simply cease to exist. Suddenly, a gruff voice broke through his despair. "What troubles you, boy? Why do you weep like a lost child?" Suk-woo flinched, startled by the voice. He looked up and saw an old man standing over him, his silhouette stark against the fading light. The man was tall and lean. His face weathered and scarred, a single, long scar bisecting his left cheek. His eyes, though, were sharp and piercing, holding a depth of wisdom that belied his rough exterior. He wore the simple, worn clothes of a hermit, but there was an undeniable air of authority about him. "Leave me alone," Suk-woo mumbled, turning his face away. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to relive the humiliation he had just endured. The old man, however, was not easily deterred. He knelt beside Suk-woo, his movements surprisingly fluid for his age. A boy running like the hounds of hell are at his heels is a boy with a story. "Tell it to me." Something in the old man's voice, a hint of empathy beneath the gruffness, compelled Suk-woo to speak. He poured out his story, the words tumbling out in a torrent of grief and anger. He told of the bullying, the false accusations, the impending ruin of his family. The old man listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Suk-woo had finished, he finally spoke. "Injustice is a weed that grows in the garden of power," he said, his voice low and resonant. "It thrives on fear and weakness. But even the smallest seed can grow into a mighty tree, if given the right nourishment." He introduced himself as Elder Beam, a former military officer who had grown disillusioned with the corrupt court and retreated to the mountains. His real name, he revealed, was Lee Beam. Beam offered Suk-woo shelter in his small, secluded hut, a simple dwelling built into the side of the mountain. The hut was Spartan, furnished only with the bare necessities, but it offered a sense of peace and security that Suk-woo had never known. As Suk-woo ate the simple meal of rice and dried fish that Beam offered, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. "I can teach you," Beam said, his eyes fixed on Suk-woo. "I can teach you to fight, to defend yourself, to become strong. But it will not be easy. It will require dedication, discipline, and a willingness to endure pain. Sukwu looked at the old man, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the opportunity to escape his wretched life and become something more. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor of fear that ran through him. "I'll do whatever it takes." The next morning, Sukwu's training began. It was brutal. Beam pushed him relentlessly, testing his limits, forcing him to confront his weaknesses. He ran up and down the steep mountain paths, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. He lifted heavy rocks, his body trembling with exertion. He practiced sword forms, his movements clumsy and awkward at first, gradually becoming smoother and more precise. Beam was a demanding teacher, quick to criticize, slow to praise. But he was also fair, and he never asked Sukwu to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. He taught him not only the physical techniques of combat but also the mental discipline required to be a true warrior. He emphasized the importance of focus, of controlling one's emotions, of channeling one's anger into strength. A warrior's greatest weapon is not his sword, Beam would say, his voice echoing through the mountain stillness, but his mind. A sharp mind is more deadly than any blade. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Sukwu's body transformed. The thin, weak boy gradually disappeared, replaced by a young man with lean muscle and a newfound confidence. His movements became fluid and graceful, his reflexes lightning fast. He learned to read the subtle shifts in his opponent's body language, to anticipate their attacks, to strike with precision and power. During this time Sukwu also grew close to Warayan, Beam's adopted daughter. Warayan was a year younger than Sukwu, with a spirit as fiery as her name suggested. She had been rescued by Beam as a child, orphaned by a bandit raid, and raised as his own. Unlike the pampered daughters of the village officials, Warayan was strong and independent, skilled in both herbal medicine and the martial arts. At first, Warayan was wary of Sukwu, seeing him as an outsider, a threat to the peaceful life she had known. But as she witnessed his dedication, his unwavering commitment to his training, her suspicion gradually melted away, replaced by respect and admiration. She helped him with his injuries, tending to his cuts and bruises with her gentle hands and soothing words. She shared stories of her past, revealing a vulnerability beneath her tough exterior. One evening, as they sat by the fire, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Warayan confessed her feelings. "I used to think you were just a weak, frightened boy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I see now that you are strong. Stronger than you know. And I admire that." Sukwu, surprised and deeply moved, reached out and took her hand. He had never felt this way about anyone before. Her touch sent a jolt of electricity through him, a warmth that spread through his entire body. "I admire you too, Warayan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are brave, and kind, and beautiful." They kissed, a tentative, hesitant touch of lips that quickly deepened into a passionate embrace. The world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them, lost in the moment, their hearts beating as one. This was more than just physical attraction, it was a connection of souls. A bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. The raw, untamed energy of their first kiss was intoxicating, a release of pent-up desires and emotions. Their bodies pressed together, seeking the warmth and comfort that only physical intimacy could provide. Their relationship, however, was not without its complications. They had to keep their affections hidden from Beam, fearing his disapproval. Their stolen moments, their whispered words of love, were precious and fleeting, tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that their happiness could be snatched away at any moment. Meanwhile, in the bustling city of Gaejeong, Jo Pildu was consolidating his power. He was a master manipulator, weaving a web of intrigue and corruption that ensnared even the highest officials. He had his sights set on controlling the entire kingdom, and he would let nothing stand in his way. He had heard rumors of a young man training in the Taebaek Mountains, a young man who bore a striking resemblance to the boy he had ordered his men to eliminate. He dismissed it at first, but the seed of doubt had been planted. One day, while Sukwu was practicing his swordsmanship in a secluded clearing, he was approached by a woman he had never seen before. She was strikingly beautiful, dressed in the elegant silks of a Joseon courtesan. Her name was Meiwa, and she carried herself with an air of confidence and sophistication that was both alluring and intimidating. "You are Han Sukwu, are you not?" she asked, her voice smooth and melodious. Sukwu, wary of strangers, nodded cautiously. "Who are you? And how do you know my name?" Meiwa smiled, a hint of mystery in her eyes. "I know many things," she said. "I know that you are training with the old hermit, Lee Byum. I know that you seek revenge against Jo Pildu." Sukwu's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. "What is it to you?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Meiwa held up her hands, a gesture of peace. "I am not your enemy," she said. "In fact, I may be able to help you. I have connections. I know things that could be useful to you." Sukwu hesitated. He didn't trust this woman, but he was also desperate for any advantage he could get. He knew that Jo Pildu was a powerful and ruthless enemy, and he would need all the help he could get to defeat him. Meiwa, sensing his hesitation, pressed her advantage. "Jo Pildu is a dangerous man," she said. "He has many enemies, but few dare to oppose him. I can provide you with information, with access, with resources that you would never be able to obtain on your own." Sukwu, swayed by her words and the undeniable allure she exuded, agreed to meet with her again. He knew it was a risk. But he felt he had no choice. He needed to know what she knew, what she could offer. Their meetings became more frequent, always held in secret, under the cover of darkness. Meiwa provided him with valuable information about Jo Pildu's movements, his allies, his weaknesses. She also used her considerable charms to seduce him, drawing him into a web of desire and intrigue. Sukwu found himself increasingly drawn to her, captivated by her beauty, her intelligence, and the dangerous game she was playing. Their encounters were filled with a palpable tension, a mixture of lust and danger that left him both exhilarated and terrified. She was a skilled seductress. And he, despite his growing strength, was still young and inexperienced. Their physical intimacy was intense, a desperate clinging to pleasure in a world filled with darkness. However, Sukwu's heart still belonged to Warayan. He was torn between his passionate desire for Meiwa and his deep love for the woman who had stood by him through his darkest hours. He knew that he was playing a dangerous game, that his involvement with Meiwa could jeopardize everything he had worked for. Meanwhile, Byum grew increasingly suspicious of Sukwu's secretive behavior. He sensed that something was amiss, that his young protégé was hiding something from him. He warned Sukwu about the dangers of trusting strangers, about the seductive power of the court. "The path to revenge is a treacherous one," Byum said, his voice grave. "It can lead to destruction, not only for your enemies but also for yourself. Be careful, Sukwu. Do not let your anger blind you to the truth." Sukwu, torn between his loyalty to his master, his love for Warayan, and his growing entanglement with Meiwa, tried to heed Byum's warning. But he was caught in a web of his own making, a web that was becoming increasingly difficult to escape. The lines between right and wrong, between loyalty and betrayal, were becoming blurred. The inevitable clash came sooner than Sukwu expected. Jo Pildu, having confirmed Sukwu's identity in his training with Lee Byum, decided to strike. He sent a detachment of his elite soldiers to the mountains, with orders to kill Byum and bring Sukwu back alive. The attack was swift and brutal. Byum, despite his age and his crippled leg, fought with the ferocity of a cornered tiger. He had foreseen this, sensing the growing threat, and had prepared as best he could. But he was outnumbered, and his old injuries slowed him down. Sukwu fought alongside his master, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down soldiers with a skill that belied his youth. He had grown strong under BM's tutelage, his body honed into a weapon. His mind focused and sharp. But even his newfound strength was not enough. Joe Pildu's men were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. BM, weakened by a poison dart, fell to his knees, a sword thrust piercing his chest. Sukwu, seeing his master fall, cried out in anguish and rage. He fought with renewed fury, driven by a desperate desire to avenge his master's death. He cut down several more soldiers, but they kept coming, wave after wave. Just as Sukwu was about to be overwhelmed, Warayan arrived, leaping into the fray with a fierce cry. She fought with the grace and agility of a wildcat, her twin daggers flashing in the sunlight. She had seen the smoke from the burning hut and rushed to help. Her heart filled with dread. Together, Sukwu and Warayan fought back to back, a whirlwind of steel and fury. But they were still outnumbered, and the soldiers were closing in. Just when all seemed lost, a group of figures emerged from the trees, their faces hidden by masks. They were villagers, farmers, fishermen. People who had suffered under Joe Pildu's tyranny. They had been secretly organized by Meiwa, who had finally chosen a side. The villagers, armed with whatever weapons they could find, pitchforks, axes, even stones, attacked the soldiers with a desperate courage born of years of oppression. The tide of the battle turned. Joe Pildu's men, surprised by the sudden resistance, began to fall back. Seeing his forces faltering, Joe Pildu himself entered the fray, his eyes burning with hatred. He was a formidable warrior, his skill honed by years of battle. He advanced towards Sukwu, his sword raised, ready to strike. "You cannot defeat me." "Boy," Joe Pildu sneered. "You are nothing but a weak, pathetic peasant. You will die like your master, begging for mercy." Sukwu stood his ground, his grip firm on his sword. He was no longer the frightened boy who had fled the village. He was a warrior, forged in the fires of adversity, driven by a righteous anger. "I may be a peasant," he said, his voice steady and clear, "but I am not weak. And I will not beg. I will fight you, and I will defeat you." Their duel was a clash of titans, a whirlwind of steel and fury. Joe Pildu was stronger, but Sukwu was faster, more agile. He used the techniques that BM had taught him, deflecting Joe Pildu's attacks, turning his strength against him. He remembered BM's final lesson, whispered as he lay dying, "The strongest force is not always the most direct. Learn to yield, to bend, to use your enemy's momentum against them. True strength lies in resilience, in the ability to adapt and overcome." The fight raged on, the outcome uncertain. Both men were wounded, their bodies covered in blood and sweat. But neither would yield. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Sukwu saw his opportunity. He parried Joe Pildu's attack, then, with a lightning-fast movement, he disarmed him. He stood over Joe Pildu, his sword pointed at his throat. He could have killed him. He could have ended it right there, avenged his master's death, and fulfilled his vow. But he hesitated. He looked into Joe Pildu's eyes, and he saw not only hatred and fear but also a flicker of something else, regret, perhaps, or maybe just the realization of his own mortality. Sukwu lowered his sword. "I will not kill you," he said. His voice hoarse. "Killing you will not bring back my master, nor will it erase the pain you have caused. You will be brought to justice, and you will answer for your crimes." Joe Pildu was arrested, but his influence ran deep and he still had many allies within the palace. It was during this moment, after ordering his men to take Joe Pildu, Sukwu heard Warayan cry for him. He instantly turned around, only to see one of Joe Pildu's men, the one that had poisoned his master, charging at him with a hidden dagger. Sukwu had lowered his guard after beating Joe Pildu, he was in no shape to dodge. Warayan leaped, pushing Sukwu out of harm's way. She took the blow. Intended for him. The blade pierced her chest. She was heavily wounded. Sukwo's world shattered. He caught Warayan as she fell, cradling her in his arms. He screamed her name. He pressed his hands to her wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was no use. The dagger had done its work. Warayan looked up at him. Her eyes filled with pain but also with a deep, abiding love. "Sukwo," she whispered, her voice weak and trembling. Don't grieve for me. I did what I had to do. I love you." Tears streamed down Sukwo's face. He held her close, his body shaking with sobs. "I love you too, Warayan," he said. "Don't leave me. Please, don't leave me." But it was too late. Her breath hitched, her eyes closed, and her body went limp in his arms. She was gone. The victory over Joe Pildu felt hollow, meaningless. Sukwo had avenged his master, but he had lost the woman he loved. He was left with nothing but grief and a burning desire for justice. Not just for himself and Warayan, but for all the people who had suffered under Joe Pildu's tyranny. He used the evidence gathered by Meiwa, who had disappeared after the battle, to expose Joe Pildu's crimes and his connections to foreign powers. Joe Pildu was stripped of his rank and executed, his ill-gotten wealth confiscated. Sukwo was offered Joe Pildu's position, the title of Dagunsa. He accepted, not for the power or the prestige, but for the opportunity to use his position to help others, to protect the weak, to ensure that the kind of injustice he had suffered would never happen again. He never forgot Warayan. He carried her memory with him. A constant reminder of the price of freedom, the cost of love. He ruled justly and wisely, guided by the principles that Biam had taught him, tempered by the love that Warayan had shown him. Years later, he found Meiwa. She was living in a small village, crippled and scarred from the torture she had endured. He brought her to the capital and provided for, ensuring that she would live out her days in comfort and peace. He could not love her, not in the way he had loved Warayan, but he felt a deep gratitude for her courage and her sacrifice. He saw in her a reflection of his own pain, a reminder of the darkness they had both faced. Their relationship was one of quiet companionship. A shared understanding of loss and resilience. He never married, his heart forever belonging to the woman who had died to save him. He lived a long and full life, dedicated to serving his people, a true hero of Joseon.